Millionaire laughed when his black wife represented herself. The court was stunned when she spoke. Richard Blackstone's laughter echoed through Manhattan Supreme Court like the roar of a predator who had just cornered his prey. Sitting next to three of New York's most expensive lawyers, the CEO of Blackstone Industries watched his wife across the room and couldn't contain his amusement. "Just look at her," he whispered to his lead attorney, Marcus Webb, a legal shark known for destroying lives as easily as others drink coffee. "She thinks she can take me on alone. It's almost cute." Camilla Blackstone sat motionless in her chair, alone at the plaintiff's table. At 34, she looked small and out of place in the imposing courtroom setting, surrounded by stacks of papers she had meticulously organized into cheap supermarket folders. Her simple black suit contrasted starkly with the $3,000 Italian suits that dominated the defense table. "Does this woman really think she can represent herself against me?" Richard muttered, adjusting his $80,000 Patek Philippe watch. "She didn't even finish college. She was just a nurse when I met her." What Richard didn't mention to his lawyers was that Camilla had dropped out of law school in her senior year to work and support her sick mother. That she had chosen nursing not because she lacked options, but because she wanted to help people. That during their 10-year marriage, while he was building his pharmaceutical empire, she had remained silent, observing, learning, documenting. "Your Honor, Judge Henderson," announced the clerk. "Blackstone versus Blackstone. Dissolution of marriage and division of property." Camilla stood up. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt, a gesture that Richard interpreted as nervousness. In fact, it was something quite different. It was the adrenaline of someone about to reveal a secret she had kept for years. "Representation?" asked the judge, a 60-year-old man with the weary expression of someone who had seen it all. Marcus Webb stood up with the confidence of a gladiator entering the arena. Marcus Webb, Whitman and Associates, representing Mr. Richard Blackstone, Your Honor. All eyes turned to Camilla. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Richard smiled, expecting her to stammer or give up. "Camilla Santos Blackstone," she said, her firm voice echoing through the room. "Representing myself, Your Honor. And I would like to start by asking my husband a simple question." The judge raised an eyebrow. Opening proceedings rarely began with direct questions. "Mrs. Blackstone, this is not the time for." "Richard," Camilla interrupted, looking directly at her husband. "Can you explain to the court why Blackstone Industries charges an 800% markup on insulin for diabetics, while producing the same drug for less than $2 per dose?" The smile disappeared from Richard's face. Marcus Webb jumped out of his chair. "Objection. Irrelevant to the divorce." But Camilla wasn't finished. "And can you explain why you said at Thursday's meeting that poor people die anyway, so why not profit from it first?" The court fell silent. Richard turned pale. How on earth did she know about confidential board meetings? There, before all the incredulous stares, Camilla stood firm, like someone guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. If this story of courage and justice is holding your attention, subscribe to the channel because you're about to find out how a nurse turned her apparent vulnerability into the most powerful weapon against one of the richest men in the country. "Objection sustained," Judge Henderson declared, but his eyes remained fixed on Camilla with a curiosity that had not been there minutes before. "Ms. Blackstone, keep your questions relevant to the divorce proceedings." Richard quickly composed himself, adjusting his Italian tie like a general reorganizing his troops after a surprise attack. He leaned toward Marcus Webb, whispering loudly enough for Camilla to hear every venomous word. "See? I told you she'd go crazy. Typical. Give these people a little power and they always overstep." His words carried the weight of generations of privilege, each syllable calculated to diminish, humiliate, reduce Camilla to what he had always believed her to be, an intruder in his world of white billionaire men. Marcus Webb nodded, but something in his gaze suggested discomfort. He had represented arrogant clients before, but he had rarely seen a wife obtain such specific information about confidential business operations. "My client is obviously dealing with the stress of a failed marriage," Marcus addressed the judge, his voice laden with professional condescension. "Mrs. Blackstone has clearly confused casual conversations with facts. Women in extreme emotional situations often create fantastical narratives." Camilla remained motionless, absorbing each insult like a sponge absorbs water. But anyone watching her closely would notice that her shoulders did not slump under the weight of the words. On the contrary, she seemed to stand straighter with each degrading comment. "Your Honor," Camilla said, her voice maintaining a calm that contrasted brutally with the storm brewing around her. "May I clarify why I have knowledge of Blackstone Industries' operations?" Richard let out a loud, disrespectful laugh. "Sure. Are you going to tell us how your background in nursing qualifies you to understand complex pharmaceutical operations?" He turned to the lawyers at his side. "She can barely balance her personal checkbook." That's when something changed in Camilla's face. For a split second, the mask of vulnerability slipped, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. It was the expression of someone who had spent years being underestimated and was now ready to use that underestimation as a weapon. "You're right, Richard. My background is in nursing." Her voice took on a new strength, echoing through the room in a way that made several people sit up straighter in their chairs. "I worked for 3 years in the ICU at the municipal hospital, caring for diabetic patients who arrived in a coma because they couldn't afford insulin." She walked to the center of the room, no longer the shy and out-of-place wife of minutes ago. "Do you know how many times I held the hand of a 34-year-old mother as she died because she had to choose between buying insulin or food for her children? 12 times, Richard. 12 women who died while your company made an 800% profit on a drug that costs $2 to produce." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Richard had stopped smiling. "But you're right about one thing," Camilla continued, her voice gaining an intensity that made even the judge lean forward. "I really can't balance a checkbook. Because when you transferred financial management to your shell companies 3 years ago, I never had access to our real accounts again." Marcus Webb frowned. That information was not in any of the documents Richard had provided. "That's a lie," Richard interrupted, but his voice had lost its previous confidence. "She always had full access to the accounts." "A personal account with a $5,000 limit?" Camilla asked, pulling a bank statement from her briefcase. "While the actual expenses went through 17 different corporate accounts, all registered in tax havens?" Richard was turning red. "How the hell did you?" "How do I know?" Camilla interrupted him, and for the first time since the hearing began, she smiled. It wasn't a warm or sad smile. It was the cold, calculating smile of someone who had spent years planning this exact moment. "Richard, do you really think that during 10 years of marriage I spent my time shopping and having lunch with friends?" She walked back to her desk, each step measured and deliberate. "Do you want to know what I really did while you were building your pharmaceutical empire on the backs of dying people?" The room was completely silent. Even the court reporters had stopped typing. "I studied. Every night, after you went to sleep, I studied business law, forensic accounting, and FDA regulations. I got my law degree by correspondence 2 years ago, Richard. I passed the bar exam 6 months ago." She paused, watching his face grow progressively paler. "You were so busy with Tiffany that you never noticed." Marcus Webb dropped his pen. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Impossible," Richard whispered, but his voice had lost all its arrogance. "You're lying. I would have known." "Would you?" Camilla tilted her head, as if genuinely curious. "How?" "The same way you knew I was documenting every business meeting you held in our home over the last 3 years? Recording every phone call you took in your home office? Photographing every confidential document you left scattered across the dining room table?" Richard's face was now completely white. Marcus Webb had begun to sweat visibly. "Every time you called me expensive decoration in front of your business friends, every time you introduced me as the little nurse who caught a big fish, you were giving me the perfect invisibility to document your crimes." Richard stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Stop it. You're making up lies too." "Sit down, Mr. Blackstone," the judge ordered, banging his gavel hard. "Your wife isn't finished yet." Camilla looked at Richard, who had become a pale, trembling version of the confident man who had laughed at her minutes ago. "The difference between us, Richard, is that I never underestimated you. I always knew exactly what kind of monster you were. You never bothered to find out what kind of woman I really am." Each new revelation was demolishing not only Richard's case, but his own understanding of reality. For 10 years, he had slept beside a woman he considered a decorative trophy, never realizing that she was, in fact, an undercover agent meticulously documenting each of his crimes. What that arrogant man couldn't imagine was that the woman he had underestimated for an entire decade was about to use his own arrogance as the rope that would hang him, and the darkest secrets she had uncovered hadn't even come to light yet. The silence that followed Camilla's revelations lasted exactly 15 seconds, but to Richard it seemed like an eternity. He composed himself like a CEO accustomed to controlling crises, adjusted his tie, and forced a condescending smile. "Very well, Camilla. You've managed to surprise me," he said, his voice regaining some of its previous arrogance. "But stolen documents and illegal recordings are worthless in court. Any judge will dismiss evidence obtained through criminal means." Marcus Webb nodded vigorously, seeing an opportunity to regain control. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's allegations are based on invasion of privacy and possible hacking of business correspondence. We request that all such evidence be deemed inadmissible." Just then, the courtroom door opened quietly, and a black woman in her 50s entered discreetly. She wore an impeccable business suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Camilla's car. Her eyes met Camilla's for a moment, and an almost imperceptible nod passed between them. Richard didn't even notice the woman's entrance. He was too focused on trying to regain his dominant position. "You may have a correspondence degree, Camilla, but that doesn't change the fact that you violated my privacy. And as for your accusations about drug prices, that's legitimate business policy. I'm under no obligation to be a charity." "You're right about one thing, Richard," Camilla said, walking slowly back to her desk. "I did violate your privacy. But there's one small detail you've forgotten." She opened one of her cheap folders and pulled out an official document. "3 years ago, when you asked me to sign the papers for the new house, you made me Blackstone Industries' legal representative to facilitate real estate transactions. Remember?" Richard's face visibly paled. That was just to give me legal access to company files as your legal representative," Camilla finished. "Every document I photographed, every meeting I recorded, every transaction I documented, it was all done within my legal powers as the company's attorney." Marcus Webb dropped his pen again. The move had been brilliant, and he knew it. Richard had inadvertently given his own wife full legal access to the company's darkest secrets. "Impossible," Richard whispered. "You never used those powers. You didn't even know what they meant." "I didn't use them publicly," Camilla corrected. "But every time you left confidential documents lying around the house, every time you took calls about illegal operations in our home office, you were technically conducting company business on the legal counsel's property. Everything I heard and saw was within my right to oversee." It was at that moment that the elegant woman rose from the gallery. "Excuse me, Your Honor. Dr. Patricia Williams, Williams and Associates. I would like to introduce myself as Ms. Blackstone's legal counsel." Marcus Webb turned abruptly. He knew that name. Patricia Williams was one of New York's most feared corporate lawyers, an expert at dismantling corporate corruption schemes. Her fees started at $1,000 an hour. "How?" Richard began, but Camilla interrupted him. "How did I manage to afford a top-tier lawyer?" Camilla smiled for the first time since the hearing began. "Richard, do you really think that for the past 3 years I've just been watching Netflix while you built your pharmaceutical empire?" She walked to the center of the room again, but now with a confidence that completely transformed her presence. "Remember that depression you criticized so much? When I spent entire days in my home office, apparently surfing the internet aimlessly." Richard nodded, confused about where this was going. "I was trading stocks. Using insider information that you openly discussed at home about mergers and acquisitions that Blackstone Industries was planning." Camilla paused to let the implications sink in. "Every time you mentioned an impending acquisition, I bought shares in the target company the day before the public announcement." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the judge had leaned forward, clearly fascinated. "In 3 years of careful insider trading, I accumulated $2.3 million. Enough money not only to hire Dr. Williams, but to fund a full investigation into Blackstone Industries' operations." Richard was now visibly shaking. That's illegal insider trading. You've admitted to a federal crime." "Admitted?" Camilla tilted her head, feigning confusion. "I never said I used non-public information to trade stocks. I only said that I made substantial profits in the market during the same period that you were discussing business at home." Dr. Williams stood up. If I may, Your Honor. My client is simply demonstrating her financial ability to afford adequate legal representation. The implications Mr. Blackstone is making about how she obtained these funds are baseless speculation. Marcus Webb was sweating visibly now. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, and he could feel that he was being outmaneuvered by far superior strategists. Furthermore, Dr. Williams continued, I would like to inform the court that my client is not here merely seeking a fair division of assets. She is filing a formal complaint with the Department of Justice regarding systematic criminal operations at Blackstone Industries. Richard jumped out of his chair. She can't do that. Marital privilege. She can't testify against her husband. Actually, she can, Dr. Williams replied calmly. Marital privilege does not apply when one spouse is suing the other for fraud. And it definitely doesn't apply to crimes against third parties, such as manipulating drug prices that resulted in deaths. It was then that Camila revealed her most devastating blow. She approached Richard, standing just inches away, and whispered loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Richard, did you really think I would spend 10 years being humiliated by you without planning an exit? You called me expensive decoration, a cheap trophy, the lucky little nurse. Every insult gave me more motivation to document your crimes. She returned to her desk and opened the last folder. I have recordings of 47 meetings where you explicitly discuss raising insulin prices to maximize profits from desperate patients. I have emails between you and executives from competing companies fixing prices. I have documents proving that you deliberately delayed the release of cheaper generic versions to protect profit margins. Richard looked at Marcus Webb in panic. Do something. Stop her. But Marcus Webb was putting away his papers. Richard, I have to withdraw as your attorney. You lied to me about the scope of the illegal operations. I can't represent a client who has concealed evidence of federal crimes from me. You can't abandon me now. Richard shouted, but his voice had lost all authority. He sounded desperate, pathetic. Actually, I can and I must, Marcus replied coldly. My professional license is worth more than your fees. Camila watched Richard slowly crumble. The man who had humiliated her for an entire decade was now alone, abandoned by his own lawyers, facing not only a divorce but a federal investigation that could result in decades in prison. There's one thing you never understood about me, Richard, Camila said, her voice soft but laden with a strength he had never heard before. You thought that because I was black, because I came from a poor family, because I was a nurse instead of an executive, that made me inferior to you. She paused, watching him tremble. But what you never realized is that people like me learn early on that to survive in your world, we have to be 10 times smarter, 10 times more prepared, 10 times more strategic. You were born into privilege and never had to develop those skills. Richard tried to speak, but no sound came out. While you slept peacefully every night, thinking you had complete control over me and your company, I was meticulously building the case that would destroy everything you built with the suffering of innocent people. What Richard didn't yet know was that Camila's revelations in court were just the tip of the iceberg. She had spent 3 years not only gathering evidence against him, but also building a network of contacts that included federal investigators, investigative journalists, and families of victims of Blackstone Industries' abusive pricing. The true extent of the operation she had orchestrated was about to be revealed, and the consequences for Richard would be far greater than he could have imagined. The courtroom door opened again, but this time with more authority. 3 people entered silently, 2 federal agents and a woman Richard recognized instantly. His face paled as if he had seen a ghost. Impossible, he whispered, his voice trembling. She's dead. The woman who entered was Elena Rodriguez, approximately 40 years old, with visible scars on her hands and fierce determination in her eyes. Richard knew her because he had tried to silence her permanently 2 years ago. Your Honor, Dr. Williams announced calmly, I would like to introduce our key witness. Ms. Elena Rodriguez, former employee of Blackstone Industries and survivor of the accident in the laboratory in 2022. Richard jumped out of his chair, knocking papers to the floor. She can't be here. This is a setup. Elena died in the explosion. Actually, I didn't, Elena said, her voice echoing through the silent room. Although you did your best to make sure that happened when I discovered you were deliberately contaminating batches of insulin to force dependence on higher doses. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge leaned forward, clearly shocked by the gravity of the allegations.
Lies.
Richard shouted, but his voice had lost all credibility. You have no proof. Camila rose slowly, walking to the center of the room with a confidence that completely transformed her presence. She doesn't need proof, Richard. I have the evidence. She walked over to the projector and connected a tablet. The screen lit up with an email dated March 2022, with the official Blackstone Industries letterhead. Email from Richard Blackstone to Dr. Marcus Chun, Laboratory Director. Camila read aloud. We need to implement the Delta Protocol on the March batches. Increase the concentration of addictive additives by 15%. Diabetics will need higher doses in 6 months, ensuring increased profits. If anyone questions it, dismiss it as natural variation in metabolism. Richard was now visibly shaking. How did you gain access to the company's servers? Camila smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. Richard, did you really think that for 3 years I was just surfing the internet? I enrolled in a cybersecurity course at MIT. Online, obviously, so you wouldn't find out. The revelation hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. You hacked my company? Technically no, Dr. Williams interjected. My client used her credentials as legal counsel to access systems to which she had a legal right. Every login was properly logged. Camila moved on to the next piece of evidence. The screen now showed records of bank transfers, numbering in the millions of dollars. But the insulin tampering was just the beginning, Camila continued, her voice gaining strength. Richard was systematically killing people to increase profits. When Elena found out and threatened to report him, he orchestrated the explosion in the lab. Elena stood up from the gallery. I should have died in that explosion. I spent 2 months in the hospital with 3rd-degree burns. When I woke up, I found out that I had been officially declared dead and that my family had received a $5 million life insurance payout to keep them from asking questions. Richard was now in a complete panic. Elena, I helped you. I paid for all your treatments. I took care of your family. You tried to buy me off after trying to kill me, Elena replied coldly. But what you didn't know was that I had sent copies of all the documentation to a secure account before the explosion. And Camila helped me recover everything. It was then that Camila revealed her most devastating blow. Richard, remember when you said that people like me don't understand business? That were just decorative trophies. She pressed a key on the tablet. The screen showed a videotaped meeting, clearly filmed in his home office. This recording is from a board meeting you held at our house 6 months ago. You can see your own face as you explicitly discuss how to increase diabetic mortality to optimize customer turnover. In the video, Richard's voice echoed clearly, the faster they die, the faster we'll get new desperate customers willing to pay any price. It's simple math. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the federal agents seemed shocked by the coldness of the words. Richard tried to stand up, but his legs failed him. You recorded private meetings in my own home? Technically, our home, Camila corrected. And as the company's legal counsel, I had an obligation to document business discussions that took place on the property. Every recording was made legally. Dr. Williams approached Richard, who was now sweating profusely. Mr. Blackstone, would you like to quickly review what my client has documented over the course of 3 years? She began to list them on her fingers. First, deliberate manipulation of medications to create dependency. Second, coordinated price fixing with competitors. Third, attempted witness murder. Fourth, insurance fraud. Fifth, conspiracy to conceal product-related deaths. Richard was now completely broken, his previous arrogance replaced by pure terror. Camila, please. We can work this out. You can have everything. The company, the money, the house. Camila approached him, stopping a few inches away. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried a strength he had never heard before. Richard, you spent 10 years telling me I was worthless because I'm black, because I come from a poor family, because I was just a nurse. You humiliated me in front of your business friends. You called me a charity project and a risky investment. She paused, watching him tremble. But you know what you never understood? Every insult gave me more motivation to study. Every humiliation forced me to become smarter, more prepared, more strategic than you ever were. Richard tried to speak, but she interrupted him. People like you are born into privilege and never have to develop real skills. You think money and connections can replace intelligence and hard work. That was your biggest mistake. Elena approached as well. Richard, you tried to kill me to protect your bloody profits. But what you didn't know is that every family who lost someone because of your poisonous drugs is here today. The courtroom doors opened again, and dozens of people entered silently. Men, women, elderly, young, all people who had lost loved ones due to Blackstone Industries' manipulated drugs. That's 200 families, Richard, Camila said softly. 200 individual wrongful death lawsuits that will be filed this week. Each one with complete evidence that I have documented over 3 years. Richard looked around the room, seeing the faces of all the people his greed had hurt. His empire, built on suffering and death, was crumbling before his eyes. This can't be happening, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. I control everything. I have power. I have money. You had money, Camila corrected. But while you slept peacefully thinking you had control over me, I was systematically documenting every crime, every illegal transfer, every death you caused. One of the federal agents approached. Richard Blackstone, you are under arrest for multiple counts of manslaughter, corporate fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy to distribute dangerous substances. You have the right to remain silent. As Richard was handcuffed, he looked at Camila one last time. The woman he had underestimated for an entire decade had methodically orchestrated the complete destruction of everything he considered important. How? Was all he could whisper. Camila replied in the same soft voice she used when he publicly humiliated her. You taught me that in this world, people like me need to be 10 times smarter to survive. Thank you for the lesson, Richard. I applied it very well. As he was led away in handcuffs, Camila remained motionless in the center of the room, surrounded by the families whose courage she had helped bring to justice. But the true extent of her victory was yet to be revealed, because destroying Richard had been only the first step in a much larger plan that would transform not only her life, but the entire system that allowed monsters like him to thrive at the expense of innocent lives. 6 months later, the headlines were unanimous. Former Blackstone Industries CEO sentenced to life in prison for mass murder. Richard was in solitary confinement, stripped of everything, while Camila had transformed the company into a cooperative that distributed medicines at cost price. Elena had become director of pharmaceutical safety, ensuring that no other Richard could poison people for profit. The 200 families received millions in compensation from the confiscated assets. Camila, now respected as one of the brightest lawyers in the country, looked out the window of her new office. It wasn't revenge she felt, but justice. The real victory, she said to Elena, wasn't destroying Richard. It was proving that people like us, whom they call inferior, are capable of using their own arrogance against them. People like Richard think privilege replaces intelligence. That was his fatal mistake. The best revenge is not to stoop to their level, it's to rise so high that they can never reach you again. If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice that prove, when they underestimate our abilities, we give them exactly the rope to hang themselves.